So to really understand why change is difficult, you have to first localize where you want that change to happen. Deliberation, our ability to think, is overrated. So if it was that easy, most of us would effectively go through those changes very quickly. Unfortunately, it is challenging, and I'll tell you why in a minute.
Hey there. Welcome to the Peakality Podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Christophe Morin, a world-renowned expert in neuromarketing and neurospirituality, with over 30 years of experience studying how we think, feel, and behave. As co-founder of Cell's Brain, he's helped pioneer NeuroMap, which is a model that blends neuroscience with storytelling to help people communicate and connect more effectively. He holds a PhD in media psychology from Fielding Graduate University and teaches neuromarketing and AI at both Fielding and Johns Hopkins. Dr. Morin is also the author of bestsellers like The Persuasion Code, Open, and Open Up, books that explore how our brains can support not just change, but healing. He's given over 2,000 talks in more than 20 countries, and when he's not teaching or writing, he's in Kona, Hawaii, where he and his wife, a clinical psychologist, run a retreat centered focus on neuroplasticity and self-healing. Let's welcome Dr. Morin. Why is change so hard even when we want it? Today's guest, Dr. Christophe Morin, is here to help us unlock why change is so hard, as he's a neuroscientist who spent decades in exploring how the brain, our personality, and even spiritual insight shape our growth. So let's dive in and speak with Dr. Christophe Morin. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Courtney.
This is exciting. So let's just dive right in. And can you just help us understand on a high level what is happening in the brain when we try to change, but keep falling into like old patterns?
So to make it simple, think of changing as reprogramming. And the brain likes most of the time to reinforce existing pathways, patterns of responses, because it's more predictable. It's more efficient to act upon these well-established patterns of responses. So to really understand why change is difficult, you have to first localize where you want that change to happen. Because we don't really have one brain, we have multiple layers in the brain. So if you allow me, I'll just describe what is really the template of how I believe we can decode many of our struggles, but also many of our opportunities. Because while change is fundamentally challenging, it opens the door for truly the life you want, the life without stress, the life without anxiety, the life without patterns of responses that are toxic. So if it was that easy, most of us would effectively go through those changes very quickly. Unfortunately, it is challenging, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But certainly the effort is rewarded with so much freedom to clear the toxicity, freedom to pursue and engage with the type of activities you feel are the most fundamental to your health, to your well-being. So going back to the brain, we don't have one. We effectively have three identifiable parts of the brain. The first one is really known as the primal brain, which anatomically speaking sits at the bottom of our brain, connecting to the spinal cord. And the primal brain is responsible for anything that has to do with your survival. So your breathing, your digestion, your sleep, sexual urging, what you ultimately eat and how much of it, and so on. It operates below our level of awareness because it's much more efficient to just carry out automation. In fact, I know you're familiar with the autonomous nervous system. There are parts of our nervous systems that are fundamentally, completely out of our control to restore, balance in our body in milliseconds, not in the time it would take to deliberate about it. Deliberation, our ability to think, is overrated. Unfortunately, it is slow. It brings confusion, it brings discord, and the brain has decided long ago, I don't know who did it, that it doesn't make sense to give agency when you're dealing with primal responses. So the primal brain is central to a lot of what's happening that can ultimately be difficult to rewire. Right above the primal brain is what I've called the rational brain. Think of it as primarily what sits above the primal, which is commonly described as the neocortex. And that layer is much newer, much more buggy than the primal brain in many ways, because this is where we learn to master language. This is where we learn to compute. This is where we learn to, at the best as we can, control some of the impulsivity that comes from the urges that are unchecked from the primal brain. And so we can recruit the rational brain to some extent to center what's going on, to reflect, certainly, and most of the time turn what is noise into logic, into reasoning, right? There is a third brain that is discussed in all kinds of circles, philosophical, neuroscientific circles, but also metaphysic circles, which is what I described as the spiritual brain. There's really no area specifically that we can point at where that brain is, formed, but I truly believe it's emerging out of certain states that we put ourselves in. For instance, meditation brings a completely different balance between the primal and the rational, and seems to, frankly, take out our energy from the box, the limiting box of our brain. And it's through these altered states of consciousness, like spiritual, that I found we have the best chance of quieting the brain and reprogramming it. So I know it's a long-winded explanation, but without the core of those three brain structure, it's going to be challenging to keep referring to what we can do to change.
So it seems as though that while we're not going to necessarily affect directly the primal brain, we do with the rational brain, the thinking. Is that correct? Or is this, I guess, when we're looking at those patterns and we're looking at change, we really have a direct effect on this newer brain, as you or
Yes.
refer to it as this rational brain, that then you could potentially influence, I guess, that I've heard it broken down into conscious versus subconscious.
Right.
Is that an easy translation?
Yeah, it is. So the primal, by definition, again, operates under the radar of consciousness. So consciousness is our ability to observe our behavior. It's one of those many, definitions that you will hear. And so one really central aspect of what I do in the book Open is to help people recognize that so many of those responses, stress response, anxiety responses, trauma responses, are automatic patterns of activity, which often create massive toxicity, lock you into states that are potentially depressive states or states of despair, right? So since consciousness is central to how this happens, restoring as much consciousness about primal activity that is good for us, like breathing, like movement, like deciding where we want to be, the container in which we are, stuck at home in the dark or in nature, being, in communication with this magical space. All of those decisions are decisions that can restore automatic balancing that is known to already exist in the primal brain. So the primal brain has lots that we can tap into to restore that state of balance. So that's one way to do it. So I have rituals in open that are actually targeting specifically the primal brain going, "Ah," just calm it first. The second step, if you're lucky, in the first one is to indeed kick in the rational brain, which gives us the capacity to reflect, to internalize, and more importantly, to start paying attention to the narrative that may be behind our fear of change. And the narrative is what I call the personal stories, the stories of the self. And making sense of those stories, number one, being aware of those stories. So many of our sort of narratives that drive our lives are not even conscious. Like in my case, in open, I talk about this savior complex. In psychology, a complex describes basically this kind of the mechanisms below the radar that are driving a lot of our coping mechanism of our behavior, and much of those often are not bubbling up to our consciousness. And so that means these patterns, these stories are deciding the direction of our mood, the direction of our responses, the directions even of our personality, right? So again, how do you make the rational brain more conscious? Well, it's a very noisy brain. It has a lot of activity. It takes a lot of space in our brain. Nearly 80% of the brain is really fundamentally part of that cortical, structure compared to the primal brain. And so what you want to do is quiet down the rational brain. And we do so, for instance, using meditation. You do so by embedding yourself in nature and really paying attention, not to the noise, but to the silence, to the beauty of nature and so on. And then, of course, ultimately, as you begin to sort of quiet and rebalance the primal, empty the vacuum of noise inside the rational, then that gives you really space to kick in what I call spiritual, transcending states that take you out of your body, that take you out of your narrative, your limiting beliefs into the life you want to manifest.
I don't think I've ever connected those dots before, of understanding why we are encouraged for breathing techniques or meditation. But
Yep.
now it totally makes sense. Like you're tapping into that primal
Yep.
brain to quiet the rational brain. And
That's
in
right.
that process, you're tapping into the spiritual brain
That's
that
right.
enables you to really enable, it sounds like almost enabling the primal brain and the rational brain to communicate even better
Yes,
or more effectively and efficiently by doing those techniques. And I don't think I ever really understood, because everyone says meditation is so hard to quiet the
it
brain.
is.
Well, it is hard. I mean, extreme, especially when you're not used to doing it. But
Mm-hmm.
it makes sense now. I never understood it before, that when you go into a meditation or you go into a breathing, it's not going to just immediately work. Because you've got all the noise that you're trying to sort through initially.
That's right. That's right.
That's
I'm also a terrible meditator, and it's very frustrating for me because I can see how much I need it. I have so many, thoughts, and
yes, exactly.
always busy and taking care of, all kinds of other, objectives and tasks and so on. But I need to empty my brain to create the space for what comes next, to create the space for confronting some of those patterns that I've come to know over time just don't serve me. And so it's an ongoing, just back to your question, change doesn't happen, overnight. There's this perception in most of our society that you can take the magic pill or the magic psychedelic and boom, that's it, you're done, right? There is a resistance to doing this work in our culture in general. We're very short-term driven. We're very driven by selfishness often, and those two, don't make us very resilient or patient in the process of change. And so it's a journey. And if you take it as such, you will find that it may be slow at the beginning, but things just accrue over time, and you enter and you rebuild who you are. And that's the promise of change. Some studies have demonstrated, in fact, that changing a habit can be as physically demanding and hurtful as an injury. And so the whole idea of changing yourself, psychologically speaking, you may find sometimes this to be, why is this so difficult? It's not like I just slashed my wrist and I'm in danger, immediately danger. Well, the research shows that actually changing a thought or changing a belief can be as painful as a physical injury. All right.
Wow.
So when you consider that, you have to take, this seriously. And that's why so many people ultimately who cannot sustain as much despair, choose to end their lives. I mean, this is just not an easy process, and yet it's where healing happens.
Yeah, I thought that was so. You have a quote in Open that I just love on page 36. You say, if emotions are constructed rather than hardwired, they can be intentionally reshaped through mindfulness, cognitive reframing, and spiritual practices. This perspective bridges neuroscience and self awareness, offering a path to greater emotional intelligence, resilience, and ultimately a more profound understanding of consciousness. I love that because it really helped me understand, like, even though we are trying to change or we think that we're stuck in a pattern, it's not hardwired. We can change if we have the right tools to do so. And I don't think I really understood that before reading your book, that I guess the power that we have over
Yeah.
changing our own patterns, and then really understanding how personality comes into play, and understanding like what our free will is, our personality, how that plays in to that change, how we can become a different person than we
Mhm.
were. But looking at a lot of people say, well, that's just who I am. How can you explain the personality, who we are, and how that plays into neuroscience and how the patterns of our brain,
Sure.
how are those connected together? How can we look at those in a way that um, enables us to feel as though that we are in power and in control?
Hmm. Sure. Well, you haven't cited that term, but the term that is front and center of your question is neuroplasticity. So I'll define it very simply. It's our, you could say, God-given gift of reprogramming or rewiring anything we want. Now, part of the neuroplasticity that most people understand is the capacity that our body in general has to repair itself. If you cut yourself, unless you have some sort of autoimmune disorder or the injury is too severe, just watch it for a few days. It's just an absolute magical process, right? It will repair itself. We can do that with bones. We can do that with very difficult situations to recover from, but a heart attack, right? So we have mechanisms in place built into the programming, the initial programming of our body that do that. What was not well known and understood, because it's a much more complex aspects to study, is whether or not we can actually rewire thoughts and ultimately behaviors. Um, and most of what we understand emotions to be is neurochemical responses, hormonal responses that are happening so quickly that we are constantly catching up to our emotions as if we had no power to change them, right?
Yeah.
Yet those triggering functions from stress, fear, disappointment, so on, are at the core, where we can go into our brain through meditation or states of consciousness that are considered altered states of consciousness, breath work, psychedelic experiences. We can literally freeze the brain emotionally and start paying attention to what are triggering those emotional response. And when you get to the root of those narratives, when you get to the fear and ultimately these stories we tell ourselves that are scary, that put us in the form of depression and so on, then you can change those reactions in the primal brain. You can literally um, control the release, of neuroepinephrine or even dopamine and so on, to the extent that you can apply the mental power that we have to do so. So neuroplasticity is possible, not just for bodily issues, but for thoughts and patterns of thoughts. And of course, the study of psychedelic states has been central to our understanding of that, because not so much on human, because it's a difficult process to do, but on rats, we have long now established the power of psilocybin from magic mushrooms to reopen what are called critical periods of neuroplasticity. And that's like incredible. We can witness this under a microscope and see situations where rats' brains, which are fundamentally very close to human brains, not in terms of number of neurons or skills, but we can, both in rats and humans, see moments in the experience of psychedelic journeys, if you will, where we have the ability to reprogram ourselves out of the trauma stories, out of that despair, which is really fundamental to how we can now see personality. Personality, of course, are mostly described as traits, which are patterns of behaviors that sort of define who you are. If you're extroverted, then you're going to be a social, person, meaning you seek out the energy and the enthusiasm of people around you. Whereas if you're introverted, you'd rather be home reading a book, right? Well, a lot of people have come to believe at some point that that's it, I'm extroverted or I'm introverted. The truth is, you can, in fact, it's been demonstrated through multiple experiments, rewire that, rewire the trait that defines who you are. So personality is not as fixed as we once believed, which is good news, because there may be aspects of your traits or your coping mechanisms that you don't think are serving you much, right? And of course, personality models, and you know too well the love that my wife and I have for the Enneagram, but also the Big Five models. All those are really cool because they can kind of do a snapshot, which may not change over time. And it won't if you don't proactively say, you know what, I want to rewire my extroversion into less extroversion, or I want to rewire my anxiety, which is a big deal in most of those personality assessments. There are patterns of behavior that often put you on the edge of, calm versus anxious, and most people who are anxious don't really like it, including my anxiety, which has been um, literally eradicated. Most of the level of anxiety that I carried for decades is now gone from my brain. And I can't tell you how liberating this is. It didn't come easy. It came with many, 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 many trips in South America to do some work with ayahuasca, especially. But it liberated me and freed me to concentrate on rebuilding myself the way I like it.
Wow. Uh, wow. There's so much there. Uh, so when you're looking at the personality trait. Like if someone were to take, because you really dive into the Enneagram and open up.
Yep.
And once you identify kind of the foundation and open as to how your brain is working, and then you go into the personality trait and open up, you're really, the individual has the control if they're one personality type to become a different personality type based on their own choosing and their own work within themselves. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Yes, it is. And since you introduced the Enneagram, mostly the Enneagram is mapping those patterns of thoughts and behaviors that define and predict the way you're going to respond socially, respond um, in a family context and in a work context and so on. And so what's really particularly powerful about the Enneagram is it was, I think, initially designed to improve your consciousness, to actually give you lenses through which you can, as objectively as it is possible, see yourself show up. Because it's very difficult to do that without the mirror back to you. And the mirror can come from people who love you, people who don't, who keep poking at your negative traits. But the work of rewiring yourself is yours. It's not going to come from people forcing you to change, right? Our sense of agency, of free will, is such that we don't tolerate typically being, a puppet. That we do it when we're kids, right? We do it because we don't really have a choice. But as we become adult, we say, no, I have the responsibility of my own personality, so to speak. And so what's really powerful about the Enneagram is it's going to give you a blueprint for transcending, especially those maladaptive response or toxic response. So all the types, 9 of them, have the power to show to some extent the shadow behind each type. In my case, I'm a type 6, which is the loyalist, the troubleshooter, and I've carried as part of that 6 somewhat of an addiction to anxiety because it drives that pattern of wanting to troubleshoot everything. So before situations become too difficult for others, I jump in and want to basically protect them from having any kind of stress and anxiety. But the one who is experiencing that is me each time. And so I didn't see that until I really looked into all those tools that I described in Open. I was really unconscious of that addiction to anxiety, and it doesn't serve your body, it doesn't serve your sleep patterns, it doesn't serve your mood and so on. So once you really look at it objectively, why would you not want to keep the troubleshooting skills without the anxiety, which is exactly what I've done.
That's amazing. And okay, so the Enneagram is just a personality type tool that
Yep.
you use as a mirror to help
Right.
you understand yourself better.
Yeah,
And
and others, as you know, the
oh,
remarkable aspect, because you cannot be looking at human personality without looking at how we interact socially. I mean, we're social creature. A personality doesn't really mean anything until we exchange either information or biologically with the rest of the creatures around us, whether they are people, plants, or animals.
yes, I love that. It's amazing. And I've learned so much from you and your wife and the Enneagram process and um working with my, children now and having
Mm.
a lot more compassion, understanding their type and how that, the interaction with them is going to be different with each one of them. So I think it's been really helpful to understand, but it's also really enlightening to understand that when we recognize these personalities and when it's coming up, we're really dealing with the rational brain at this point, but we're
Yep.
trying to reprogram the belief system in the primal.
Hmm.
And I never really looked at it and understood the connection with the breathing techniques, the meditation techniques, and the personality types, and how you can really, how they all work together. It's been really helpful to understand. And you talk about psychedelics. Now, can you explain to me when people, when an individual undergoes a type of psychedelic, what exactly is going on with your brain and the process when you're in your under in the medicine and in the journey, however you want to term it? Can you
Mhm.
explain how someone, or the benefits in which is taking place within your brain, that enables someone to kind of open up that, I guess, primal understanding or insight? Uh,
Mhm.
what that what is going on neurologically in that process?
Okay, so it's a big one to unpack, and let me be clear. I'm not arguing or presenting an expertise over the many people that are researching psychedelic states. What I can say about what I've witnessed, what I've experienced myself, is the process really does have a neurological and neurobiological, especially, basis, which is well understood. The part that is a little more complex is the states that are created, which vary enormously, do have similarities in terms of opening up opportunities for growing your consciousness and or finding the higher meaning of suffering, the higher meaning of trauma, the higher meaning of even joy, right? So at a neurobiological basis, we do now understand, I mean, chemically, that these plants, most of what I have studied are plant based, medicine, so to speak, and we know that they change the chemistry, particularly in our brain, by either reducing certain neurotransmitters or augmenting or metabolizing more neurotransmitters, and especially front and center is this particular one called serotonin. So serotonin is well known as a mood regulator, is well known to open our, compassion, our empathy, our ability to experience love and wonder is correlated to certain dosage of serotonin. It can be, however, very, very dangerous to have too much serotonin in your system, which is why if let's say you're on an antidepressant treatment, it's not recommended to decide to do a psychedelic experience. So all those things are very, very somewhat complicated and should be really examined carefully. Of course, there are legal considerations and so on. But the biology is the easy part. The part that is more difficult to understand is what do you do with that experience? That experience can be indeed challenging. It can be blissful, but what do you do with it? And so in my case, what I wanted to do with Open is show the power by, in fact, talking about my journeys in Peru during a shamanic program for a month, and document and journal about these experiences so that I can start really examining the threads. Examining, and of course, I've been studying stories my entire career as a media psychologist. So I wanted to move away from just understanding the effect of advertising into understanding the effect of these stories that give us an opportunity to increase our consciousness, to give us more lenses through which we see ourselves, like we see ourselves, right? And then understand the mechanisms of rewriting those stories. And I truly believe that psychedelic states, which is not specific to psychedelic states, breathwork can do that, meditation can do that. The way in which they interact with our brain is a bit different. The speed at which it happens is different. And I think the reason why so much work is done around psychedelic states is because it's more efficient. in many ways than meditation. I mean, I know it's taken for people sometimes years and years of sitting, in clearing their mind from the noise before they get into that blissful. And that's beautiful. I mean, I'm just in awe of people who can do that, right? Some people don't have that time. Some
Yes.
people are in such deep suffering, at the borderline of suicide. They just cannot afford to wait.
Yeah.
And what's both sad and shocking is to see how slow the process of legalizing some of those substances is, under the supervision of, as it should, competent medical, official frameworks. Got it. Um, and yet we see untreated depression. We see how trauma healing is so difficult and so slow in many cases, right? So back to the effect. Yes, there's that biological aspect, which is fairly easy to understand, particularly as you look into the role of those neurotransmitters. But that's not it alone. What if through those experiences we end up opening portals of consciousness that are not part of our body? And as a scientist, it took me decades to actually accept and understand the possibility that consciousness is not just an emerging process from our neurons, but it might be all around us. Nature has consciousness, clearly. The cosmos has some consciousness, obviously. So what if we're not just simply bathing in all that consciousness, and those moments of reflection, of deep internalization of our states, could be an opportunity to connect to the rest of that consciousness?
I love that. I think that's beautiful. So it took me being raised in a traditional environment, and upbringing of, religion and understanding what people were even meaning when they would say consciousness. Like,
Right.
what is I mean, what even is consciousness? Just having that understanding of, the present moment, and understanding our thoughts in that moment. Um, was essentially my understanding of consciousness, being aware and
Yeah.
being present of my state of thinking
Hmm.
is essentially the foundation, if you will,
Hmm.
of the word consciousness, and being aware of that state, of that mindset. Is that a fair?
It's one of the many definitions that are floating around. I have one in the book because I felt, okay, I might as well contribute one in terms of how I see consciousness as a spectrum of energy. That energy can be obviously coming from that neurobiological processes that I described in the brain, but it could be also be ambient energy. When you start getting into these new theories of consciousness that integrate quantum physics, especially, that see a quantum dimension of our consciousness, there's so many hypotheses that are impossible to prove, but give us this ever evolving picture of what consciousness is. And what we do know, if we can't define it clearly, is that working on raising our consciousness brings more health, brings more resilience, brings more happiness. And if we just simply focus on that, then, what it is ultimately doesn't matter as much as how we feel about ourselves. And often consciousness can also be reduced to just that, our ability to feel. And the reason this one very simple definition is gaining popularity is because of AI, is because of
Yeah.
either the excitement that AI is going to ultimately show us that we can program consciousness, or it scare the shit out of us,
Yeah.
right?
100%.
Where we can start thinking, wait a second, do I really want an assistant AI that has the capacity to be me? right? So there's a lot of existential fear about it. The evidence coming from most smart people on the topic is that we have figured a way to program intelligence inside a machine, the ability to identify the tasks that need to be accomplished to reach a particular goal. And I'm a huge user and fan of the power of AI, not its carbon footprint, but the power of AI ultimately, I think, can solve problems that our brains just don't have the capacity to solve. But AI can't feel. It can be programmed to fake it, right? And a
Yes.
lot of people are developing relationship with AI that begin to fantasize that AI may in fact be conscious or will be conscious. But the consensus, I think, overall is that it won't.
Yeah.
But for how long? The problem is not that it will eventually. The problem is it will mimic quite successfully. It will persuade all of us that it has consciousness, and that's where the big trap of our relationship with AI is going to be pretty, I think, tricky.
Uh, so really to oversimplify the or give an analogy that I heard fairly recently was when you do psilocybin, you imagine that you're at a ski resort and you've got different ski paths in which have, green, blue, black diamond. And each one of those paths have been, there for a period of time. And those paths, they're already, the snow's packed down and you can, what to anticipate, whatever level.
Mhm.
From my understanding, our brain and our neural pathways are similar. And when you do psilocybin, what it does, it puts down fresh powder. So you don't necessarily see those paths, but you see other paths and possibilities as well. Is that a fair analogy? Maybe that's, again, back to oversimplifying it, but just for a visual for people. And then going back to being conscious in those moments, when you find yourself about to go down one of those pathways, being aware that you can go into the old pattern, the old
Yeah,
pathway,
yeah,
or you can choose this other pathway. And
right.
then how do you choose? Going back to what you were saying about feeling, which one
Mhm.
feels best
Yeah,
versus familiar? Is
right.
the familiar the pattern of the old way, or something that could be maybe uncomfortable because you're unfamiliar with it, but could maybe
Mhm.
feel good going and trying it, could be the new pathway? Is that it? Is that a fair
Yeah, yeah. So what you're
analogy?
what you're describing is the power of our imagination. And that is, I think, ultimately the biggest gift of these altered states of consciousness. One very well studied effect that pretty much all psychedelics, I like to call them entheogens, right? In terms of how they really grow our capacity to feel, to relate, to empathize, and so on. So these substances have, excuse me, have a direct effect, all of them pretty much, on what's called a default mode network. So DMN is cited pretty much in every single paper you will find on researching the effect of psychedelics on the brain. What is it? Think of it as the idle mode of our brain corresponding to the ever obsession of our ego, the driver of our personality, to control everything. So to control everything, we use a ton of energy. I mean, it's very difficult to quantify anything in the brain. We have 86 billion neurons, trillions of connections, which are called synaptic connections. But there is an estimate that is floating around that the default mode network, that idle egocentric energy, takes probably close to 80% of our entire energy. Now, how do you want to have the space to heal if so much of your energy is basically tied to noise? right? So what's been really remarkable is see on a very consistent basis that psychedelic states reduce or suspend the default mode network. Put it on pause, basically. It's not about diluting the ego, it's about suspending it, basically. And when you suspend the ego, it's like when you clean you know, your mess in the bedroom. It's like, whoa, there could be a beautiful plant there. Oh, I feel so much better about myself living in an environment that doesn't have clutter and this and that. Well, that's exactly what's happening. You've just decluttered your brain. And so not only can you see better consciousness, but you can imagine. You have the resources now to see those paths of healing, to see that you no longer have the fear or those limiting beliefs in the way of making this possible, which is why, for anyone doing this work, we see and witness people who overnight can quit drinking, can say, I understand my trauma, I respect my life as having this trauma, but it's not who I am, and move on. I've seen this. I've seen hundreds of those testimonials that are pure magic, pure bliss, and confirm what is still debated, you know, at the level of laws and regulations, as it should to some extent. But we're just dancing around so much evidence that, of course, indigenous societies have carried and transmitted in their old traditions to their upbringings for thousands of years. There's thousands of years of evidence
Yeah.
supporting these states of consciousness during which we truly have restored the capacity to imagine.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. No, that uh I never connected it that way either. There's been so many aha moments in just a short
Good.
period of time of our conversation, um, that I definitely would love to dive into this more.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be respectful of your time and the audience, but this has been a wealth of um,
Good.
knowledge, understanding, much better than I did before. So thank you for explaining a lot of this
Of course.
to me and to others. And
It's
um,
only taken me 4 decades to fully understand what I'm talking about.
it's
So
amazing. It's amazing because it's all these questions that we have and understanding how it all connects. Like, how does it all connect, and how can we understand it so that in our daily lives when we're struggling with anxiety,
mhm,
is it our personality? Is it just who we are versus our belief system? Where did the belief system come from? How
right.
can we actually change it? Can we actually change it? And really what you've to summarize, we can change. And I
Yeah.
love the techniques that you have in your book, Open. I love the book Open. I have basically the whole book is underlined and highlighted
Yeah.
because it's like, oh, I didn't really understand that before. And the way you articulate it's really, really well done.
Thank you.
And Open Up's really enabled me to understand myself and
Hmm.
my children more, and how we can like really start to look at ourselves and try and make different choices. And now that we understand that, how what's going on neurologically in those moments is really profound. So thank you so
Yeah,
much.
and no, you're welcome. And just to clarify for your audience,
Please.
in the book, first of all, there's really it's very biographical, so I'm very transparent about my struggles, some that I really carried for decades, and 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 I describe this experience of a month in Peru, immersed in a Shipibo village where they worship the plant, the forest, and Peru has put in their constitution the critical sacred importance of the brew that I mentioned earlier called ayahuasca, whereas it's still considered, illegal here in the United States. So again, our perspectives are different about how we see our healing. In the Western states, we see our healing through the medical, system, which I love when I need it. But it's pretty obvious that it has massive limits, particularly as it relates to mental pathologies. Somehow it seems very, very difficult to just handle a condition like depression or trauma just through a pill that is basically numbing, for the most part, the symptoms that are emerging from those conditions. So I think our approach to these mental health challenges has been in need of reinvention. And there is a movement which is really sort of global, worldwide, to finally do that. I do think, for instance, AI is going to help us actually accelerate some of that research that we so desperately need. So the point I'm making is, yes, there is a neuroscientific basis of it all, and I do unpack it in the book. It's a little heavy to start getting into the brain. It's not exactly always easy. Then there's the story dimension, which I'm very, very keen to bring in the book as an opportunity to finally decode those narratives and recognize that they are driving so much of your behavior. They sometimes resurface in your dreams, if your nightmares and so on, in your psychedelic trips, if you do that, or meditation and so on. So they are difficult to get rid of. But the best part about it is you can proactively, redirect the energy of your stories towards the life you want. And the third step of the book is, so how do you do that? Once you've become more conscious, once you have not only understood your story, but find opportunity to transcend the part of your story that is bringing so much suffering. How do you do that? So I was keen to identify many, many rituals, programmed, moments, actually, ideally daily, where you meet yourself at the spiritual level, at the rational level, at the primal level. So I have 26 of those rituals, which many of them are completely natural. Let's be clear, this is not a book about psychedelic states. It's a book about how do you heal yourself by going beyond the primal and the rational into the spiritual realm, which I've only come to even consider real only 15 years ago. I was very late as a materialist scientist. I denied the benefit of not just spiritual states, but religious states of any kind, because I couldn't see the evidence anywhere in the brain. And so my model of looking at it was so limited and encapsulated by the belief of a materialistic scientist. So it took me a while just to get out of that, and now it's just incredible to be able to look at all those rituals and see that most of them cost hardly anything. And yet can have profound effect on your health and happiness.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love the book. I think it
Thank you.
really is perfect. The story and then the understanding and then the solutions. That three part has really helped me really wrap my head around all of it and how to apply it to my own life. Is
Wonderful. That's the
understanding
point.
it and then how to apply it. So
Cool. That's
really profound, and really thank you for your time and explaining some things that I had been struggling with for a while and understanding how they all work
We all
together.
do. We
And
all do. And so it takes, as you did, a little bit of time just to open the book, or we do retreats here in Hawaii to really help people also work from a container. I call that in the book the temenos, which is what Jung described as a sacred container, sacred place. Sometimes it's just your home, sometimes it's where you are. We've moved to Hawaii because of the energy of that land. It's volcanic, it has beauty, we're embedded in nature. Sometimes nature can't be really demanding, it rains a lot and so on. So, but hey, it makes you humble. It's like, okay, I get it. We need this rain because the plants are thirsty and this and that. So we're constantly reframing our experience from the perspective of the spirit of the island. So
that's
it's really a
beautiful.
beautiful temenos, a sacred place to do some of this work.
That's wonderful. That's beautiful. I love it.
Hope to
This
see
is
you
really
here
great.
sometime.
Yes, I hope to make it out there sometime soon. Well, thank
Yes,
you again for your time. I
you're
sincerely
welcome.
appreciate it. And if something sparked you today, definitely pick up a copy of Open or Open Up and start noticing your patterns, not judging them, but rewiring them. And if this podcast helped you, like share it with someone you care about, because transformation is personal and it's also something that we can do better together. So thank you again, Dr. Morin. I'm greatly
Thank you,
appreciative and look
Courtney,
forward to
for
having
inviting me.
you on
I
the show again.
love for you to spread the good news, and especially today, in the midst of a lot of disturbing news, we can at least recenter our energy around focusing on what's possible, and use many tools that are available to do so. So
That's
thank you.
perfect way to end. I love it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.